What do climate change and gender, and in this case, the role of women's leadership, have to do with each other?
I mean, it's so apparent that like there's a lot of women that are leading the change in climate change, but when you start to get to the decision making level, that's where you see that starting to dissipate. And I've been to conferences where you see panels of decision makers and it's all men. And there's really strong research out there that like the moment you have women in those decision making positions, the solutions are more collaborative, they're more inclusive, they're more holistic, they're looking further in the long term because women perceive climate risk higher than men do in general. And so it's, yeah, I think the making sure that women are in leadership positions and decision making positions is incredibly important to have effective solutions and effective action.
Was there a person or an event or just a moment that kind of drew you in?
I think it was a slow pull for me into the climate world. And I think that's because when I was in high school, I wasn't thinking about climate change too much. I did a scuba diving course when I was in grade 11, and I went underwater and like it blew my mind. I was like, what is this world that you can see underwater? And from then on, I decided I was going to be a marine biologist. And so I went to UVic and started as a marine biologist doing my courses, and they touched on climate, like you'd see the graphs on CO2 increases and biodiversity loss, but it wasn't until my third year where I did a conservation course with Dr. Julia Baum, and she's an like a marine biologist, an ocean conservationist, and incredibly active in the climate space as well. And she was showing us these graphs and these statistics that in order to protect the ocean, we have to look at climate change because that's the ultimate amplifier, and that's causing acidification and sea level rise and ice-free summers in the Arctic and biodiversity loss. And so I think from that course and then some of my subsequent courses, I got pulled into kind of this world of climate change because in order to protect what I loved underwater, I had to engage in the climate conversation. And so I did a little bit of policy work, but I think, and then another thing that really kickstarted, I think, my engagement, or I don't know, kickstarted, but probably amplified it, was going to COP24, because I'd been engaged in so many climate conversations in different ways, but had never seen kind of the unified conversation of so many people from around the world coming together to talk about climate change. And so attending COP24 in Katowice, Poland in 2019 with Kairos Canada and PWRDF, I think really opened my eyes to the complexities of climate negotiations at the international level.
For me, my climate justice, actually, interestingly enough, began in Toronto, you'll be glad to know. My husband is a doctor, and he went to Toronto to the World AIDS Conference. And he came back and he said, there's something coming down the line for Africa which is worse than AIDS. And I was like, nothing can be worse than AIDS. Look at what we're going through. And it was the debut of the Inconvenient Truth. And he said, you have to see this video. So then we watched it. And for me, the overriding thing was, I'd heard about climate change before, but it was just this thing far away. And suddenly I realized this is real, this is true. And I cannot have my grandchildren look me in the eye in years to come and say, you knew and you did nothing. So I think it was very much that sense of this is knowledge that I can't unknow. I now know it and I have to act. Otherwise I will, I'll be letting down the generations to come. My mentor, my inspiration was Bishop Elina Wamukoya from the Diocese of Swaziland. But she was just the most wonderful, humble, hardworking, inspirational woman, and completely integrated the environment into her ministry as a bishop. And she said once that she felt that God had called her to be a bishop at this time because she was the only person in the House of Bishops who knew the pain of carrying water on her head and walking for kilometers and then having it slip and fall and then have to go back and get water again. And so that was something that she carried with her, that the pain the pain of African women that she personally had experienced, which the men did not know about. They could see it or they could hear about it, but they did not feel it personally. And so that is why the environment was so crucial to her. And she actually became the first chairperson of the Anglican Communion Environmental Network that I worked with. Yeah, so she was a real inspiration and just modeled fantastic leadership, just drawing the diocese with her, challenging them theologically, practically. Yeah, and very, very sadly, she died of COVID. So we were all gutted. Yeah, but she's left a big legacy. And then, of course, in Africa, we're all so inspired by the late Wangari Maathai, just her passion for change, and that she said to people, growing trees is my thing. What is your thing? You can't do everything, but find your thing and go for it, all guns. You know, if you're a plastic warrior, be a plastic warrior. If you're a climate justice warrior, be a climate justice. Find your thing and do it to the best of your ability, but don't try and do everything and feel like you have to do everything. And yeah, she's a constant inspiration, I think, to all of us.
Can you just tell us a little bit about her for those of us who don't know her?
So the late Wangari Maathai, she was the first woman in Africa to get a Nobel Prize for the environment, and she founded the Green movement in Kenya.
I think at the international level, I've had the privilege of attending a few different international conferences, COP24 being the first one, so the UN Climate Change Conference. But then last June, I went to Portugal to do or be part of the UN Oceans Conference. And then just recently here in Vancouver, we held the International Marine Protected Areas Conference, Impact 5. And it's been really interesting, and they're different conferences and like slightly different approaches, and COP has been there for so long. But I think what I found hope in, kind of looking at COP to UN Oceans to Impact 5, is that the conversations that we're having, the keynote speakers that are present are becoming, the conversations are becoming more holistic, and the speakers are becoming more diverse. And I think especially when I compare the places I went to or events I went to at COP, where even one of the facilitators said, and we now have one woman on this panel turning this mantle into a panel. That was like, well said. Because so many of the panels, even one event which was on women and climate change, had a panel full of men. Like, it just was wild. And so like seeing Impact 5, which again is a bit of a different conference, but had Indigenous voices at the forefront. They were bringing in like storytelling and different ways of communicating to, I think, what you sometimes traditionally see in some of these conferences. Yeah, there's a lot of work still to be done to be changing the lens and the way that we're seeing some of this work, but that's inspiring to me. I feel like the change, even in the past 10 years, I think you have to see the hope in that. Like we are changing. The action is being taken. We have to continue taking it, but action is happening.
Catherine Hayhoe is a person who gives me a lot of hope. I mean, I'm sure you're also all very inspired by her, and knowing she's Canadian as well. But I feel like she's able to speak the truth and the bad news, but then she always has that balance of the hope that, you know, change is coming, and our job is to make that change happen as fast as possible. And I feel that that is a message that really inspires you into more action, rather than thinking it's all so disastrous, you can't do anything. I think one of the most exciting moments of my life, I was lucky to be at UNEA, United Nations Environmental Assembly, when they passed the agreement that they were going to have this treaty, international binding treaty on plastic pollution, which is one of my things I'm really passionate about. And to be actually in the room when they announced it, we all screamed and jumped up and down. And then I was just along the row, actually, from, it was a joint one that was put in by Rwanda and Peru, and the Minister of the Environment from Rwanda was just along the row from me. So I rushed over to her and gave her a huge hug. a small lady, you know, dressed in her traditional Rwandan clothing, and just what a dynamo, you know, to be able to be the person who brought through that treaty, that I think just gives us all a lot of hope that, yeah, things are bad, but step by step, as Jessica says, things are turning.
I think one of my inspirations, especially over the past like few years, has been Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. She lives in the US, and she's she's an ocean scientist and a climate activist. And she, I think, speaking about how everyone needs to do something, she created this Venn diagram system where you look at like, what are you really passionate about? What are you good at, and what is like a climate issue, and trying to find that kind of centerpiece of then what can you do, what action can you take. And it's really neat, and I've used it in different science education or climate education kind of forums in different ways. And it's so neat to see how everyone from kids like to adults to people who've been there for like working in this space for a long time, like to try to challenge the way that we see climate change and see it as something that we can all participate in.
I find the young climate activists from Africa really, really inspiring. I mean, it was really amazing at Lambeth because we were able to bring Liz Watuti from Kenya. She's a young activist, and she spoke. Yeah, I think that was a highlight, hearing her addressing all the bishops at Lambeth. And she said something very key. I think she said, you know, you bishops, you have a seat at the table. So if you can open the doors for us as young people, it's easy for you. You can make an appointment with the minister of whatever and you know, ask for an appointment. We can't, but you be the ones to open the door and then let us, you know, then speak, kind of thing. And I thought that was a very, very prophetic thing to say. And then also Vanessa Nakati from Uganda is a real inspiration. She had a really tough time at, I think it was the previous COP, where she was they had a picture, of course, with Greta and the other climate activists, and then the journalist cut her out of the picture because she was the only black face in that picture. And she could have turned and become very bitter and you know, angry about it, and she handled it with great grace. I think she's a young woman of great faith. I mean, she's very, very committed Christian. It's actually on her Twitter. Her Twitter profile, I think, talks about being a Christian, and I think she took that learning and has helped others to learn, you know, about how environmental justice is racial justice, and how you know, if we don't fight racial injustice, then we can't fight environmental justice, and gender justice, environmental justice, and racial justice. Those three have to come all entwined. So I think those two young women have been a great inspiration for me. But in our context, youth is up until 35. So often you'll find that there's a young person on the panel, and there'll be somebody in the 30s. And actually there's one generation that you're missing out. So to consciously get the teenagers as well on board. So young, I would say young teenagers and young women. So not just have a woman's voice, but a young woman's voice is really, really important.
Right. And I would pass back to Jessica, who's been a member of our youth council and knows PWRDF well. What would you say to us about how we need to apply a gendered lens?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree with everything that Rachel said. And I think really ensuring that there's ideally 50% of women at the table. And I think one of the other reasons to have more than just one, and not, often that is very tokenistic when there's only one, but is that, one woman doesn't represent every woman's experience, like, especially when you're looking at age or you're looking at, people of color, Indigenous women, like everyone's coming with a different perspective. And so, you need to have that. And I completely agree. Like I'm 30 now, and like, I don't know what the 16-year-olds want anymore. And yet we're all considered youth and under this one umbrella. And so, I think it's incredibly important that we bring, the youth, kind of the under 20s or the early 20s, into these dialogues and conversations. and not just to the dialogue and conversation, but to actually be able to make decisions.
Mhm.
I've seen that a lot where like youth are invited, or yes, whoever is invited to the table, but they're there as like, to speak, and then everyone says thank you, and then the decision goes on with, whether it's the men or whoever it is that are actually at that decision making table. So I think like giving those giving women and giving youth and an actual decision making position, I think, is really important. And yeah, I think there's lots of ways. I think keeping that gender lens on everything that PWRDF is doing, like thinking again when doing monitoring and reporting, like how are we gathering gender disaggregated data? How are we identifying with our partners like the barriers to women engaging in different conversations or at different tables because of things that they need to do, different roles. Yeah, a lot of the things we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation. There's lots of barriers, both with our partners internationally, but also here in Canada. And I think just in general, barriers that women face in accessing different opportunities. And so how do we help to identify those and then provide supports or whatever assistance we need to help to reduce those barriers?
I think for me, it's the grandmothers. We tend to focus very much on the youth, but in Canada, in the Anglican Church of Canada, I mean, I experienced this when I was doing the AIDS work as well. That there were this powerful force of grannies who had energy and time and who really moved on this thing. And I'm seeing this now in the climate space as well. That passion, I mean, I suppose that thing that sparked in me when I saw The Inconvenient Truth of thinking, what would I say to my grandchildren? What about my grandchildren's future? That is actually a really powerful motivation for grandmothers to get involved in this space. And I'm not seeing that so much here. So I find the inspiration, I think, from the grandmothers. They just now on Earth Day, one of the diocese of Nova Scotia, they were involved with a climate march, and they had all the grannies were dressed up in amazing costumes and things, and I think they called it the raging of the grannies. And I think that's really powerful, and tapping into the love that the grandmothers have for their grandchildren, and also that motivation, and they've got so much energy and creativity and some time in their lives as well that they can give to volunteering is very powerful.
Yeah, I've learned a lot. I feel like I've been really privileged, especially at these international conferences when you're able to interact with so many people out of your immediate bubble. I think I've definitely learned that it's not a radical position to be pushing for like immediate climate action. Like when I was talking to some women that I met at COP24 about how, like from the global south, and how they're seeing that their islands are going to be going underwater, like they're going to be losing their entire homes, like their entire communities. I think it just reminded me that like this push that we're trying to do here in Canada and in North America is so important, and it's not like we're already seeing the impacts of climate change here as well, but that it's really important to be pushing for kind of immediate, really strong climate action